Give it one more minute and then we'll start. Excellent. So let's start. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being there this morning. And thank you, everyone, for being back at this session today. We're absolutely delighted to have you back here for our launch conference and workshop on the EU Academy. Thank you very much for everyone for making it today. Let me just give you first the outline of the program for this session now, and then I'll introduce each speaker in turn. So the first paper, the session is called Teaching the European Union on the Island of Ireland. And of course, we also have the first presentation that is, of course, presenting one of the other teacher training grants by Dr. Emmanuelle Schön-Quinlivan, and of course, Dr. Philip Murphy, who's presenting Teaching European Politics at Primary and Secondary Level in Ireland. Then we have Dr. Giada Lagana from Cardiff University, who's also the president of IASIS, and Mr. Niall Robb from Queen's University Belfast on the future of European studies, a cross-border perspective from the island of Ireland. This will be followed by Professor Andrew Cottey from University College Cork on teaching European foreign security and defence policy in Ireland, which will then be rounded off by our very own Dr. McDonagh from Dublin City University, who will be talking about teaching EU foreign and security policy in small states. Let me take each one to introduce each one in turn. So now I'll first introduce Emmanuelle, even though she's not actually here. But I thought, given that she's leading that teacher training project, I will introduce her nonetheless. She is today, unfortunately, she has a bad cold, so she can't be here, but she is a lecturer in European politics in the Department of Government in UCC since 2001. She was awarded a Jean Monnet Chair in Active European Citizenship in 2021 and a Jean Monnet Teacher Training Grant, the very one that we're discussing, one that is in fact one of 20 Europe-wide in 2022. The focus of those projects will be to develop a continuum of education in Ireland and the EU from junior infants to 6th year. Emmanuelle is also the director of the UCC Hub in Active European Citizenship, and this hub is the home for all the programs and activities emerging from the Jean Monnet Chair and the teacher training. It'll also become the focus of interdisciplinary collaboration in European studies. From 2017 to 2019, Emmanuelle led a Jean Monnet project entitled My Big Friendly Guide to the European Union and co-funded by the European Commission, Communicating Europe Initiative, DFA, and Cork City Council. It developed a pupil-centered, bottom-up program of discussion, discovery, and fun on the European Union's values, symbols, purpose, and ambitions at primary school level. Based on critical pedagogy, it was constructed with pupils and teachers' reflections, views, and artifacts in order to generate understanding on ownership. Now, she is leading the project, but in fact, today here is Dr. Philip Murphy, who is based also in the Department of Government and Politics at University College Cork. His primary research interest lies in the political socialization, political engagement. His doctoral thesis focused on the socialization of political efficacy among adolescents in the Republic of Ireland. The research project received an Irish Research Council postgraduate scholarship under the supervision of Dr. Clodagh Harris. Concurrent research with Dr. Harris assessed the impact of community education on political engagement among the asylum-seeking community in Cork. He's also currently working on publications in the following areas: the measurement of political efficacy, the relationship between political trust and efficacy, and the role of gender in political engagement. He also edited the Irish Political Studies Data Yearbook for the period 2012 and 2014. Now, subsequently, this is followed by Dr. Giada Lagana, who is also the president of IASIS, and she's a lecturer in politics at Cardiff University, School of Law and Politics, and of course, as I said, the president of the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies, IASIS. She started out as a historian, completing a BA in Contemporary History at the University of Pavia in Italy, and an MA in Relations Internationales et Histoire du Monde Atlantique at the University of La Rochelle. Her PhD study secured 4 years funding from the National University of Ireland in Galway, where she worked under the supervision of Professor Niall O'Doherty. Her book, The European Union and the Northern Ireland Peace Process, is based on her dissertation and was published by Palgrave Macmillan. The book demonstrates that the role of the EU in the Northern Ireland peace process was much more significant than had previously been suggested. It makes an original contribution to the literature and, of course, has been widely praised. Since then, she's joined Cardiff University in 2019, and she works with Professor Daniel Wincott in the framework of the ESRC project Between Two Unions, the constitutional future of the islands after Brexit. She's published several articles with high impact journals. She's written a short chapter for a report produced by the UK and Changing Europe on Ireland and future Ireland's membership of the EU. And she has also secured funding from the Project House Europe at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Innovation for All Impact Fund of Cardiff University. Now, this will then be followed by Professor Andrew Cottey, who is professor and EU Jean Monnet Chair in European Political Integration, also at the Department of Government and Politics, University College Cork. He's been at UCC since 1999 and was also the head of Department of Government and Politics from 2013 to 2018. He teaches and researches, of course, in a variety of different areas that are all connected to this project. He's been a NATO Research Fellow, a Research Associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a visiting researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Previously, he'd been at the Department of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford, and his significant publications also include The Security in a 21st Century Europe, Understanding Chinese Politics, and Introduction to Government in the People's Republic of China. He has a number of different research interests that are in the area of international relations, international security, and of course, global governance. His research is primarily focused on European security, with an emphasis on the development of European security institutions here, and we will also hear about that in due course. And then finally, of course, our very own Dr. Kenneth McDonagh. He is Associate Professor of International Relations, and he's also the head of School of Law and Government here at DCU. He was previously the Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences from 2019 to 2021. His research is focused on the EU foreign and security policy, primarily also the common security and defense policy, the role of small states and CSDP, and the gendered impact of CSDP missions. He's published a wide variety of different things. He's published, for instance, on the EU as a global actor, also on the gendered impact of CSDP missions, and contributed to policy papers and various training activities in the area of women, peace and security, and CSDP. Currently, he's the PI, the principal investigator of the Horizon 2020 ITN Global India, www.globalindia.eu, which aims to train a new generation of experts on EU-India relations and empowers them with the skills and expertise to contribute to the EU's engagement with India. He has also been the PI of an Irish Research Council-funded project on the gendered impact of CSDP missions in the Western Balkans, which produced various training materials, policy reports aimed at the European External Action Service and other stakeholders. He's also, of course, the editor of the Journal of Contemporary European Research. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And without further ado, I'll hand the floor now to Philip, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Just to inquire, speaking time, what should I keep it to?
Perhaps 15 minutes, something like that.
Okay, that's grand. I'll try to share a screen here and you can let me know if I'm successful.
Yeah, we're starting to see something.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, grand. And let me know if there's any issues with audio. I'm in a relatively common room here in a research facility. So if you have any issues with sound, do interrupt. So thank you, Christian. As he mentioned, I'm here in place of Emmanuelle today. So Emmanuelle is really the brains and the drive behind this project. And so the recently launched Hub and Active European Citizenship has 4 strong pillars that I'll outline briefly, and then I'll give a little bit more detail on the teaching material and the development of the teaching material, with some references to some of our other pillars of activity as well. So our contact details are there if it's relevant for anybody viewing. And also Emmanuelle is very active. She runs the Twitter account, so at Hub Europe Citizen. She's quite active for the Hub there as well. As you mentioned, Christian, this project, our current development of content and material is comes from 2 prongs really. So the Erasmus Plus Teacher Training Grant from 2022-25, and also Emmanuelle has a chair in Active European Citizenship. So that was responsible for some of the other preceding work that she has done. So in terms of the 4 pillars, the first one is a teaching and learning material, so at primary and post-primary level. So the primary, as you mentioned, is a big friendly guide to the European Union, and the secondary one, which we're working at the moment, or post-primary, is called DAB the EU, which stands for Discuss, Argue and Build the European Union. And the whole nugget or gist of that is around having discursive, deliberative and agonistic content. So we're trying to go beyond just knowledge learning and go beyond, in some ways, activity-based learning. That's the core of it that I'll mention in a while. We run CPD courses and training courses for primary and post-primary teachers as well, online and hopefully back in person again from next summer onward. And I'll mention briefly as we go through toward the end some of our research aims, which we are really only at concept development stage and running them through ethics committees at the moment as well. So I guess to mention Emmanuelle's primary school program, so it's the Big Friendly Guide. She developed this in collaboration with a primary school principal here in Cork. About 5 years ago, they started piloting the content. So the format of it is that teachers register for the training and teachers deliver a 6-week program then at their level in primary school. It works off of the main resource as a website, which provides all of the lesson plans, all of the slides, and all of the activities and assessments. And as you'll see from the image on the right, there's a teach zone and a kids zone. So even for schools and students and young people who aren't registered or don't have a teacher registered with the program, Emmanuelle and Trish have developed quite interactive materials there around quizzes, activities, and one of the favorites seems to be our Shamey the Shamrock mascot for the program, and he's kind of dominant in that area of the website. The main approach, I guess, is that it's flexible content, so that it's flexible both in the schedule, so teachers can use the content as suits them during the year once it's delivered, once the 6 sessions are delivered, and also the content is developed across the primary school curriculum. So for junior infants and senior infants, there's a level of content. First and second, there's a level of content. Third and fourth, there's a level of content. It's the same for fifth and sixth. But if a teacher has a class that she feels or he feels needs a more basic or elementary introduction, they can pluck and choose content from above or below their level, and they can run content as suits their class in that way year to year. So it aims for flexibility, and it aims for a teacher having the freedom to decide themselves what works in terms of content. So that's a key element of it, I guess. In terms of the link with the schools, so the teachers get certification, and if a teacher runs a program, they get a European Star Teacher Award. So that's part of the hook in terms of trying to spread the program. Schools get recognition. We didn't realize going into this that having a plaque on the wall of a school is a major thing, competing with the other programs that are out there in different teaching areas, that having some sort of school recognition is a very important thing. So we learned that, and Emmanuelle learned that early days. And also we try to have wider events that we're building on year by year, such as student graduations for those who complete the module, but also wider events. So in May of this year, Emmanuelle hosted a conversation where students had the opportunity to raise questions of the European Parliament President, Roberta Metsola. And I think she had over, if I'm right, there was over 200 separate classes registered between Irish schools and other schools. So there was quite a lot of Greek schools, Romanian schools, a few French. So she's trying to develop links not only within the schools, but across the primary level as well, across European countries. In terms of the content of the program, there's a big focus, and we have this at both levels, a big focus not on member states and not on learning about what they do in France and Italy and Spain and Ireland. We're trying to focus on the EU aspect. So trying to focus on it as a club, because it's quite interesting, obviously, for young people to learn about what they eat in different countries and the different parts of culture and how they do things differently. But the aim is try to focus on the European level. So that is one important distinction, I guess. But also, while doing that, trying to make it relevant for young people at their own level, so that the activities and the topics that are picked, and even when we're talking about policy or rules, that it's made local and it's made real. And that can be relatively easy to do depending on the subject area you're talking about. And also that it's active, and this is something that goes for any program that's at primary and post-primary level now, that it's not knowledge-banked education, that it's active activities or interactive activities where there can be peer-to-peer learning and interaction as much as. So these are a few of the examples, I guess. In terms of teaching cooperation between European countries, Emmanuelle came up with this idea of an EU smoothie, where each country has an ingredient and they merge them together and make the smoothie. And you find out things like it's impossible to remove one color, one fruit once the smoothie is made. So it can also be used to teach Brexit. But the students themselves can have a lot of fun around, what is the right product for what country, thinking about what country exports what and where fruit comes from. And there's a lot of extensions can be run at it, I guess that's worth mentioning. So Brexit specifically can be taught through using Jenga, and this is something we've done with a much more customized Jenga set than that, so that you can remove a few pieces, but you remove enough and all of a sudden the stability is risked, and we don't use words like stability. And also the final piece of the 5th and 6th class program, so they're the older students, that they run a simulation, a European Council simulation. And it's interesting, when we run this with teachers in the training program, teachers seem to get as much out of this as the students do themselves. Teachers really seem to like this activity because they themselves feel that lawmaking or EU institutions are something that they're not comfortable interacting with, they're not comfortable teaching with. But when they do through something like a simulation, they have relatively basic briefing papers and positions. They're quite interested in that as an idea, and the students themselves are quite enthusiastic to be able to change their classroom with flags, have a format, and really get into the idea of what the basis is of European decision making, I guess. And in all of the activities and projects, there's an attempt to try and link schools with other schools through the e-twinning format. So not just in Ireland, but elsewhere. And the last year, Emmanuelle has built that as a host for some of those projects. Focusing on the post-primary level, and this is very much work in progress. I guess we're only 6 months into our work. So in terms of the DAB program, it's being developed by Emmanuelle and myself at the moment, and we're in partnership with a local large post-primary school here called Kinsale Community School, where we're piloting content at the moment. And I'll give you an idea in a second about the type of content we're talking about. So because post-primary level, it's not as simple for us to say or to ask teachers to deliver multiple pieces of content. So it's allowing them the opportunity to cherry pick content. So teachers can register for the training during the summer, which is a much harder thing for us to try and get to hook at post-primary level, because there isn't the teacher training days. It doesn't apply at the same level. So that's something we're discovering as a difficulty as to how we can offer it and how we can sell and engage for the teacher training side. But it allows teachers to pick the content. And it will run off of a resource, the DAB website, which we're developing at the moment. And I think we're finding it quite complicated as to how to structure and frame that, because as to whether we focus on a topic level or a strand level within subjects or a subject level, because the content is much more fragmented. And I'll mention some of the advice we got back from teachers, which makes it a bit more tricky as to the development and the packaging of content. I guess that's something worth mentioning. But it's a work in progress as a website. Our approach, and this is coming from the teachers going back, I guess 6 months ago, we thought that we could develop content and be in a position whereby teachers would feel that they could use 3 or 4 of our lessons as they taught on a subject. But all of the feedback coming back to us is saying, no, that they don't have the time and the flexibility, particularly at junior cycle and leaving cycle, so that we need to package the content, not at class level, but at a small piece of content that they can plug into themselves when they're teaching some other class and they have a lesson. So it has to be smaller and it has to be flexible. And our focus, I guess, has maybe been on developing that content for certain subjects, but a transition year and moving much more transition year where there's a lot more flexibility to develop a lot more depth in content, I guess, and a greater exposure to students. So we're focusing on transition year. For those who aren't familiar with the Irish post-primary education, transition year is a voluntary year that students do after their junior cycle before they start their leaving cycle, but it has become something that quite a lot of the students do. While it's an option in many schools, it's become quite extensive, but it's a lot more applied learning, so there's a lot more flexibility for teachers and schools as to what's offered within that year. And we see it as a very useful gap between the junior cycle civic, social and political education module, which is relatively small, and the now developing politics and society leaving cert subject, which is still only offered in a relatively limited number of schools. So there's a big gap going on there, and this is what teachers tell us, that there will be no take up for politics and society in a lot of schools because CSP is so small and their exposure is so small that students would consider it quite a jump to go and study that then for a leaving cert where they're conscious and focused on developing points and considering where their points will come from. Our approach also at this level, I guess it's worth mentioning, is we're trying to develop links and activities across school, and this is why transition year helps, and that we've the platform to do it through that, but also working with existing programs like Design for Change and Young Social Innovators, and having our own events. A big focus in the coming year is around a Europe Day event in City Hall here in Cork. We're trying to get interaction with primary and post-primary students and competitions running through those events as well. This is just a brief outline. I'll show it and skip, I guess. It's just to note the distinction. At junior cert level, we'll pocket content in all of these areas. So the history subject, the business subject, geography and languages, and we'll focus quite a lot on that civic, social and political education. At leaving cert level, we get the same subjects, history, business. I mean, there was even a question on the leaving cert English subject last year, which was quite political, and which if you had EU content, you could plug it just as easily in as national level content. The question was quite open about developing a political speech. And at transition year level, our focus is on providing workshops, which will be half day or 1 day workshops, or else having this modular classes that teachers can run for a few weeks in succession. You'll notice the arrow out of place there, and this is coming from our own discussion with transition year students. When we've gone into pilot in a few different schools in Cork in the last few weeks, and we're asking what level of knowledge they have of the European Union, where it comes from, even though they've all done the wellbeing subject and the sub part on politics, there's very little knowledge of the European Union. The teachers all say this back to us, that the European Union is a very movable and small part of both of those curriculums, both of those political curriculums, and teachers aren't comfortable or confident around teaching it, so they tend to leave it to the end and do as little as possible. So we see transition year as an opportunity to build that out in terms of an extension of content. I guess our focus here, I'm conscious of time. I'm assuming I've about 3 or 4 minutes left. Am I right in that?
Sure, don't worry.
Okay. So I guess the focus of our content at secondary school level is primarily on developing this notion of multi-level citizenship, and bearing in mind that that the youth have very little notion as to what happens at European level. Some are aware that there's a European stamp on their passport, but not a lot are. They're aware of the euro when you ask them about it, but beyond that, there's very little appreciation of policy like the environmental effect, the agricultural effect. So we're trying to develop this idea of awareness of their rights and responsibilities around political identity and citizenship at a European as well as national. Coming from my own research background, we're also conscious of not only students' efficacy or sense of confidence around understanding Europe, but also their own teachers as well, because this is something that's coming back to us and something we'll focus on in the training aspect of it. And through those transition year subjects and workshops in particular, we're trying to focus on going from beyond discussing the European Union, but also into deliberation and an agonistic approach, whereby people can settle on different positions and try to get a greater understanding of those different positions, rather than it just being about knowledge and trying to come to agreement, but an appreciation of different positions around any policy area, I guess. So I'd mentioned teacher efficacy, just to give you a quick outline of maybe three of the themes or topics. And we're in a kind of a flux of a space, because Emmanuelle and myself are not European policy experts. So we're relying on Ken and other experts, Diarmuid Thorney and more, to provide us, and they have provided us with information about the key topics and themes that they would think should be taught. And we're converting that into a kind of more active, activity-based stuff. So around the conception of the European Union, we're developing drawing and writing exercises. Around political identity, we're developing moving debates and self-positioning exercises. And around rights and responsibility, we have a kind of an EU chase, if any of you know of the chase quiz competition on TV. So we're trying to build the content through interaction, and then all of those activities followed by discussion or deliberation. I guess to wrap up on the teaching side, what we've learned to date, we've learned that there's a great opportunity for teaching about not only European studies, but the European Union in those political subjects, because it's pretty underdeveloped at the moment. There's also an opportunity for active and discussive content. So in particular at Leaving Cert level, the teachers in politics and society say that there's great flexibility. A lot of them really like the curriculum. There's great flexibility for having large discussions. It's moved away from the module that we would have, or the approach we would have taught around banking learning. Teachers have said they do have an appetite for the content because they feel they need more to be more versed in it, but there are practical caveats like the time one I mentioned, and you will get this from all teachers, but also a practical one, that they want interactive developed exercises, but they appreciate that from school to school and even within schools, there's quite a variety as to the IT, what's available. So having stuff on a website won't work. In quite a lot of cases, there needs to be the offering of printout sheets because the interactive stuff won't work. PowerPoint doesn't work. I was in a school myself last week where 3 PowerPoints, an overhead projector in each room, but none of the bulbs were working, any of the overhead projectors. I was the first one who was looking to use it possibly all year. So while it's there, it's varied, and we need to remember that in developing the content. This has been said to us. My screen seems to have frozen, but the other thing we've learned from teachers, I guess, is that you can't focus on knowledge banking anymore. You have to try and have more interactive content with students. Coming back from the students, what they have really taught us is that their main perception of the EU is still economic. It's still what Bridget Laffan said 20 years ago, is that we engage about the European Union through an economic. When we ask them to draw about things about the European Union, they all draw the euro, they all draw holidays. None of them draw anything environmental, and none of them draw anything about agriculture. So there's a major opportunity there for us to make it more real on a policy level. And finally, I guess in terms of what we've learned from students so far, is that predominantly their learning around the EU so far is around institutions. They see it as boring, dry institutions, things that people do in Brussels. They don't see it as the policy. So I think that's an area there for us. I'll leave it at that for now. And when we come to the questions, if anybody has any questions about our research, it's well versed probably in what I've mentioned so far. Okay, thank you.
Many thanks. That's great. Thank you for the fantastic presentation. So now, without further ado, I'll hand over to both Giada and Niall.
Thank you so much. Now I will try to share my screen, which, okay, I'm not sure if I can, as usual. the amazing side of technology.
You should be able to. There's a share screen. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, and so can you all see my presentation?
Excellent.
Thank you so much. Sorry, and I also have to apologize because I have to dash at a quarter, let's say 5 to 4 for my last teaching session of this year. But in the meantime, I would like to first of all really thank Christian and Sarah for their lovely invitation. We are very proud as IASIS to attend to this launch and to support this project in every way we can possibly can. And I want to also thank my Vice President, Niall Robb, who is a brilliant PhD candidate at Queen's University of Belfast, working on the influence of interest group in the UK withdrawal negotiations. And he accepted today to share this space with me. So thank you so much, Niall. Our presentation will focus on the causes of recent years' decrease in the number of European programs on the island of Ireland, the falling in students' number in those that still exist, and the evident downgrading of the subject area. But we do propose more positive solutions, so it won't all be on a negative note. Most of all, we argue that broad economic constraints and political challenges to the ethos and orientation of Irish higher education have impacted on the vitality of European studies tradition on the island. But however, we do believe that this trend can be reversed, and in doing so, it should also include institutions north and south. I apologize that this chart ended up to be much smaller than I wanted, but it provides an overview of the programs, of European studies programs in Ireland. We have sourced it from an article published by Dr. Mary C. Murphy in 2014. And a brief online research has told us that little has changed when we look at the current offer. But what is changed is the diminished prestige and status of the programs and the numbers of students enrolled in it. The appeal of Irish studies is true has waned and changed over the years. And against the backdrop of an expanded student population, the number of European studies students has not experienced a comparable expansion. So higher numbers of students in Irish higher education has not translated into similar higher numbers of students into European studies program. And we have asked ourselves why. So first, as pointed out by scholars such as Professor Bridget Laffan, it is clear that from the late 1990s, the falling levels of interest in the study of the European Union coincided with a negative shift in Irish public and political attitudes towards the European Union. In addition, the period from the mid-90s to 2008 was a period of exceptional national economic prosperity. But the bulk of graduate employment opportunities resided in the constructions, the IT sector, communications, and pharmaceutical sectors. So the availability of these attractive and well-paid jobs meant a burgeoning in the number of Irish education programs catering to the needs of these industries and a subsequent increase in students' interest in these specific areas of studies. So against this changed political and economic backdrop, a drop in entry point requirements and a reduced students' intake for the less instrumental European studies product is perhaps unsurprising. But the European studies community has responded to this challenging and to these, in particular, challenging external developments, and has sought to both diversify and embed the study of Europe and the EU in what already existed. So it is increasingly clear that such studies are not monopolized anymore by the label European studies. And this is the fundamental shift that occurred, we think. So from an understanding of the European Union as a unique or sui generis form of international organization, the EU became normalized, a normalized and political system that can be best understood from within a comparative perspective. And therefore, studies of the European Union have been incorporated into a diverse range of courses where knowledge and understanding of an increasingly pervasive and influential European Union is imperative. And Brexit has entailed further change in the context and perceptions of the European Union in the Republic of Ireland and also north of the border, with certain a rise in the interest for studying the European Union. But I leave the stage to Niall to present what is happening north of the border.
Thank you very much, Giada, and thank you very much to everyone for the organizers for putting together the conference, which has been very interesting for what I've been able to attend, and indeed for having us to present. So what I've put together is a small amount of information about the situation in Northern Ireland, informed by some online research and discussions with some colleagues at Queen's. But the information for Northern Ireland is less readily available than what we were able to find for Ireland itself. However, it seems from initial research that European studies has developed following a similar path to what has been described by Giada. So while standalone European studies programs are no longer available in Northern Ireland's universities, European law and European politics modules have been integrated into wider law and politics degree programs for undergraduates. This mirrors the incorporation effect, which Giada referred to in the prior slide. So given that I'm a PhD researcher at Queen's, I'm going to use the example of Queen's and politics at Queen's. And so this offering comprises of modules relating to the European Union at undergraduate level at all three levels of that BA in politics, and postgraduate taught levels, and their annual study trips to Brussels. We also have a number of postgraduate research students like myself engaged with European studies, and quite a number of those looking at issues related to EU withdrawal. So appropriate for the conference that we're having, European studies isn't confined to what happens in the university classroom. Queen's is involved in a wide range of public engagement activities around European studies, particularly post-Brexit, through some high-profile projects that have been going on, and also through more routine engagement with civil society, with businesses, and with others in Northern Ireland explaining the European Union. So as it relates to the cross-border element, that being the focus somewhat of the presentation, scholars in Northern Ireland continue to engage, regardless of Brexit, with European studies associations such as IACs. The last two vice presidents of IACs have been based at Queen's. And so there's a strong push within the organization to ensure that we continue to engage in European studies on an all-island basis. We also are engaged in associations such as UACs, and Belfast will be hosting the UACs conference from the 3rd to 6th September in 2023. So this is a conversation that we continue to engage with in IACs, and I'll hand you back to Giada now to talk about how we navigate the available opportunities.
Thank you so much, Niall. So how to navigate then the opportunities that exist? First of all, what we think is that there is a strong post-Brexit rationale for maintaining and strengthening European studies as a distinct programs of study. And the question that we should really ask ourselves as association, but also as European studies scholars broadly, is the question, why should we care? And the response to this being subsequently employed to sell the importance of European studies in the post-Brexit environment. And the answer to this, why should we care, should embrace a multitude of subjects, positions, and policies ranging from the European role in bringing peace to Europe, and also more locally to Northern Ireland, to the island of Ireland, as more and more is discovered about the role that the EU really had into the peace process. And even more broadly, it is even more relevant following Russia's invasions of Ukraine. So that, but also, for example, the role of the EU to reduce regulation and red tape, and from promoting a cleaner and greener Europe to sustain the world's largest trading bloc. So European studies is well placed to respond effectively to these needs. Second, we should really focus on the students and graduates of European studies, because they are by definition multidisciplinary, mobile, flexible, and highly competent human resources, friendly to new structures of employment and economy in a constantly changing and challenging international socio-economic context. And I can really relate to that. As Christian said at the very beginning of this session, I am Italian. I did my BA in Italian in Italy, my master in French. I got a PhD in Ireland in English, and now I am employed in the UK. But this multidisciplinary and this ability to work in different languages has always been something that has characterized me as a scholar, and that has really been, let's say, one of my best selling points when I was applying for jobs. So the last point that I would like to make is how to integrate this new market-driven approach to Irish higher education. And to some extent, the European Studies product potentially fits neatly with this new conceptualization of how education is best delivered at third level. However, the lessening of a number of students and the falling into entry requirements to the discrete European Studies degree programs in Ireland begs the question, to what extent do Irish European study programs produce graduates with an optimal mix of generic and specialist skills and knowledge? And there is a secondary issue here too, in terms of how effective the Irish European Studies community is and has been at selling the merits and the appeal of programs which enlist, at least on paper, meet the standards of the national strategy for Irish education, for higher education till 2030. And so, in conclusion, we do think that the challenges faced by European studies in Ireland and on the island of Ireland outside Brexit are not just ones of a resource of a financial nature, but there is nevertheless more which European study programs may offer to students. For example, greater pedagogical experimentations, and the opportunities exist because novel teaching activities exist in networks like those just presented, those who are assisting, who we are assisting at for the launch, that are facilitated by Jean Monnet and national and international professional associations. And as IASIS, we are committed to do our part to help European studies in Ireland, and we feel strongly that the Department of Further and Higher Education needs to be included as a partner in the efforts to properly support European studies teaching in Irish universities. And we leave it here for the moment. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you both. That was fantastic. So without further ado, I'll just hand over to Andrew.
Okay, great. Well, nice to see you all, and again, thanks for the invitation as well. And I think my presentation will be a little bit different. I have no PowerPoint for a start, but I think it will draw on from some of the stuff that Giada and Niall were talking about, and in particular, I think, you know, there's one question about, you know, how far does and should European studies be taught as European studies with distinctive programs versus the integration of European studies into other programs, and that might be something that, you know, would be interesting to return to in the discussion. I mean, maybe my first point I'll make is that when I started thinking about this event and preparing for it, I sort of said I'd try and put my kind of social science hat on and just say, well, what do we actually know? And my first conclusion was, I think that we probably know rather little. So I mean, I think even what Giada and Niall did there in terms of an exercise, just kind of, and building on Mary Murphy's, I think, earlier work, kind of mapping European studies programs is useful. But so far as I know, for instance, we don't have any surveys of third level students about, you know, their experiences of being taught about the EU. We don't have any surveys of staff who teach these issues within the Irish universities. So I think, you know, if you take, you know, from a sort of social science perspective, you say, what do we know? There's probably a kind of knowledge gap, and there might be kind of useful kind of research project or projects there for people just to actually investigate that, maybe. So that's just one sort of broad observation. I mean, my own work is on foreign security and defense policy, and that covers the EU, but then I also bring in things like NATO and relations with Russia as well. And I mean, I'll come on to some kind of anecdotal reflections at the end of what I say, but I thought it might be useful just to think about, you know, what's kind of distinctive about the Irish context in terms of teaching students about foreign security and defense policy in general, and then, you know, how that plays out in terms of teaching about EU foreign security and defense policy. And I think there are a number of kind of characteristics of the Irish political system and of Irish foreign security and defense policy, which are quite distinctive, and that then impacts, you know, teaching in terms of teaching about the EU in these areas. So I'll just try and sort of map out what I think some of those distinctive characteristics are. One, obviously, is that Ireland, I think, is, you know, relatively consensual as a society and a political system rather than polarized, and that, you know, has important implications for kind of thinking about and societal attitudes to foreign security and defense policy. Second point I would make, and of course, you know, this would be sort of well known to everyone here, but is simply the unusual nature of the Irish political party structure. Obviously, Ireland doesn't have, if you like, the traditional European left-right political party structure, but ordinarily that political party structure and the more traditional model plays out in terms of the politics of foreign security and defense policy. So I think Ireland is different, or arguably something of an outlier in that context. And then the third thing, obviously, is you know, neutrality, and, you know, it's obviously, you know, well known, of course, that you know, there's a very strong, and I would argue deeply embedded consensus in favour of neutrality here in Ireland. I mean, you know, I would go so far as to say it's often really simply viewed by most people as an uncontested good. And again, that, you know, then impacts on, you know, how we might teach about Irish foreign policy in the context of the EU and so on. But the next observation I'd make is that if you look at Irish politics in general, foreign security and defense policy are relatively low salience political issues. I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong on this, but I would wonder if there's ever been an Irish general election where foreign policy has been a really significant issue. Certainly, I think it would be rare that foreign policy is a major issue in an Irish election. Obviously, referenda sometimes have been different. So, you know, we've had the famous referenda on the Nice and Lisbon treaties. But in general, I think my broader argument would be that, you know, very often foreign security and defence policy, including as relates to the EU, is a kind of low salience issue. The other point I'd make, which again is well known, is about the role of the Dáil and the relatively weak role of the Dáil in terms of holding governments to account, and the relatively weak role of the Dáil committees in particular. And I guess, you know, if you just think about the Dáil committees, if government minister or a senior civil servant is called before the Public Accounts Committee, they know that they might be in for a grilling, and you know, this could be a serious issue. That the Foreign Affairs and now Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee doesn't generally have the same weight, although, you know, that is beginning to change. And then more broadly, I think, you know, that there's just a low level of understanding, in particular of security and defence issues. So I think, you know, public understanding by sort of any reasonable assessment could be viewed as relatively low. So I suppose my broad point there is there are a whole range of factors that make Ireland both distinctive, but have also perhaps produced a relatively low level of understanding and quite often interest in particularly security and defence issues. And that's changing now, and I guess, you know, it's probably been changing for 20 years. You could go back to the 1990s and debates around Partnership for Peace, and obviously more recently with the work of the Commission on the Defence Forces and so on. There is, you know, I think more knowledge, more understanding, more awareness of these issues. But I suppose my broad point is I think that all of this impacts kind of how we might teach, and, you know, kind of awareness of these issues. So I suppose those are just some kind of contextual thoughts which for me are interesting to reflect on. I'll just say a little bit maybe then specifically about teaching the EU and teaching EU foreign security and defence policy. And again, certainly from what I know, particularly of UCC, but I think the other universities, and this would kind of reinforce Giada and Niall's point, is that, you know, bespoke European studies degrees have been a declining phenomenon, but the EU is taught in other contexts, obviously. So politics and IR degrees, also our colleagues in law degrees and law programs, to some extent business programs as well. It's interesting also, certainly sort of from my understanding in EU, and I guess it may be the same in other Irish universities, that if you look at the language degrees, they, you know, French, German, Spanish, and so on, those degrees and the staff and the students tend to have quite a strong orientation more towards culture and literature, and much less towards the EU institutions, EU policies, and so on. And I mean, finally, then I thought might just be useful, just, you know, sort of my own, and these can only, I guess, be more anecdotal reflections, but it certainly, you know, there is strong interest in international relations, foreign affairs, security, and this includes the EU foreign policy, EU defence policy. You know, I guess like other colleagues, you know, you're regularly getting undergraduate and master's students wanting to do dissertations in these kinds of areas. And my other anecdotal observation would be that students are quick to learn, that you see usually a kind of quite rapid and positive kind of learning curve between first year through third or fourth year, or up to master's level, and so on. And then maybe just one other thing I'll just put out there as a thought, which is probably deeply unrealistic. But if you think about European studies degrees, or if you think about politics and international relations degrees, those are students who are self-selecting to do these things, and those are the students who are interested in the European Union and related matters. If I had my own way, I make myself dictator of the world, as it were, for a day. I personally would make a case that all third level students should have to do some kind of intro to politics and IR 101 module, and that should include the European Union, and that should include the European Union's global roles. Just as a caveat to that, I would also say that not just to be the kind of the politics professor promoting the study of politics. My view would also be that equally all students, and I would want the kind of humanities and social science students to have to do some kind of intro to 101 intro to science module as well. So I guess my kind of final point there is that teaching and learning about the EU can come in lots of contexts, even within a university, and it doesn't just have to be in context of European studies degrees or politics and or IR degrees as well. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. And now I'll hand over for the final presentation. Ken, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Christian, and thanks very much, Andrew, as well. So I'm just going to see if this share screen is working.
We can see it fine.
That's great. So unlike Andrew, I'm not competent enough to speak without PowerPoint, but I'm mostly going to be spending my time reiterating most of the points that he just made in some ways, and looking at this sort of sense. What I'll talk about specifically really is a module I've been teaching in DCU for the last 4 years, and previously taught in Community University in Bratislava. And it's sort of my experience. It's been a John Monnet funded module in DCU for the last 3 years. So it is about using those opportunities to mainstream European education into the kind of degree programs Andrew was talking about. People who study at master's level, but not necessarily choosing a European studies label to do that. So the module in question is EU Foreign and Security Policy, and the project was EU Foreign and Security Policy Teaching and Practice. So should now we'd slide forward. So just a little bit about the module in the DCU context. It was about exploring the emerging role of the EU as a foreign and security policy actor, and given that combination of theoretical and intellectual tools to try and figure out what the EU is in its external facing role, how that reflects member state interests and cultures, and what kind of activities the EU has been engaged in. As I said, it's been running in DCU since 2019 and was previously taught in Bratislava. It was at the time in 2019, I think, the first postgraduate politics module in DCU looking at EU issues. So maybe we're running against the trend that Giada and Niall identified, in that we've been expanding our European Union and EU studies offerings, particularly at postgraduate level, over the last 4 years. The module itself in both contexts was an optional module offered at master's level. In DCU, that was our Masters in IOR, International Security and Conflict, our European Law and Policy Masters, and as part of the Erasmus Plus funded IMSIS Masters on Security, Intelligence and Strategic Studies. And sort of over its 4 iterations here, there's been over sort of 150 students from many different nationalities have taken the course. What was different about the module, or at least what I told the EU was different about the module, is that it, as Christian mentioned in my bio, it foregrounds the gendered aspect of foreign policy, looking at the EU as a gendering actor and a gendered actor in and of itself, and how that reflexive element is worth looking at to examine critically to what extent the EU lives up to its commitments around gender equality, and can it repeat some of the great successes it's had at the domestic level among member states in terms of its foreign policy action. It's also focused very much on creating students who are ready to go out into the world and impact policy. So the assessment was focused around policy papers, around group presentations, and thinking about communicating some of those complex EU issues to diverse audiences. And initially, when it was proposed, it was about developing online learning tools that people could dip into remotely and in an open source context. Obviously, the first iteration of the module in the funded version ran in the spring semester of 2020. So online learning became, I suppose, much less of an innovation in comparative terms in that particular context. So what were the lessons? The first, and I think this reflects a little bit what Andrew was saying in terms of demand, is there a strong interest in both contexts in the module, that it didn't have any problem filling numbers. It's averaging about 30 students per year, which makes it one of the larger postgraduate options in a DCU context, and it was similar in Bratislava as well. So in both contexts, there is an appetite for postgraduate teaching in the space, and I think I'd be rather hopeful that appetite would be reflected elsewhere. If you give students the options, it's almost a build and they will come kind of approach to EU studies. It's about bringing it into the curriculum and make sure it's there and represented. And when it is, it does tend to attract good numbers. Picking up a little bit on what Andrew said, and he kind of captured the Irish context for teaching foreign and security policy quite well, in terms of the relative low salience of foreign and security policy in general, and the national affinity to concepts of neutrality. It was very interesting to teach this course in 2 quite different intellectual settings, where from an Irish perspective, the concern is that the EU is doing too much, so it's becoming a super state, or talk of a European army can sort of distract the classroom. In a Slovak context, it was quite the opposite, that the EU was, not living up to its promise or its potential in security and foreign policy, that primarily foreign and security policy was something that lived between the member states and NATO, and maybe a bit of an ambivalent attitude to the idea of the EU developing an independent capacity in that context. So it's always worth looking at the contextual factors when introducing European studies concepts, in terms of what's salient to the particular setting, and how the same set of actions can look as overreach or underreach, depending on the perspective that you're looking at. There were some commonalities in that, both Slovakia and Ireland, albeit from different edges, are relatively peripheral European states, relatively small. And within that, there was sort of a degree of common concern among the students that you have reflected in discussions about, well, it makes a lot of sense for small states to look towards this cooperation, seeking to use the EU as a lever to extend their own influence internationally. That sort of marked, that was slightly different to the perspective that be expressed by students from some of the larger states. Interestingly, back in 2013 to 2014, and this is my one claim to fame, so I'm going to state it now, I did predict Brexit was going to happen. I did the opposite on TV about a week before the referendum, but that was a slightly different issue. But it was very interesting to discuss the UK case with Slovak students, where you have that bit more of a remove than you do when doing so in Ireland. And there was a general sense among them that, the UK never quite Europeanized, and we'd had to have that discussion about Europeanization and public policy. And when Europeanization fails, does that explain what would drive a country to look towards the exit under certain circumstances? So it's very interesting to sort of unpack those kind of questions in different contexts. The last point I kind of want to make before finishing up is to pick up on something that I suppose both Giada and Niall drew attention to, and Andrew drew attention to as well, which is, to what extent should we read the decline of your distinctive European studies programs as a decline in European studies? And is there some strength in the idea of mainstreaming European studies across the curriculum? I think there's some very interesting synergies between Christian and Sarah's project and the project led by Emmanuelle down in Cork, in that, you know, if we look at Emmanuelle's project as producing content that teachers might introduce into the classroom, you know, Christian and Sarah's project is looking at creating the skill set among teachers and the knowledge base among teachers that will allow them to bring that in. And the reason I think that's quite important and significant is, you know, when we put on an optional module or we have students apply to a European studies program, we have self-selecting students where we have people who are already interested in the European Union, already aware of why they might be interested in the European Union. And there's a risk that it becomes almost ghettoized in that context, that it's European studies aficionados talking to themselves and not really reaching out to the broader population. And that's what that idea, you know, bringing it in as examples in our broader modules, whether that's on political institutions and international relations theory, and so on, I think is something we need to consider, as well as providing you know, distinctive options and pathways within existing programs. So I'm going to, you know, borrow Andrew's idea of being dictator for the day. I would suggest a third strand to his kind of core curriculum for first year, third level students, and that's languages. Because one of the big contrasts we had, our experience in teaching in an Irish context and in a Slovak context, was the linguistic ability of the students, in that we tend to be, you know, monoglot in this country, and there isn't necessarily the recognition that to sort of maintain our engagement at a European level, speaking other European language as well is really important. And one of the challenges in all of our curriculums is about making sufficient space to bring that in. So I might finish up there, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Ken. That's fantastic. 4 wonderful presentations. So I imagine there'll be some questions. So who wants to kick us off with one of the first questions?
There were already some questions in the box. Maybe you want to...
Let me see. Yeah, there were quite a few, but there's so many that I now have to go back to see where it starts. Okay. So here, there's a question from Paul. Philip's material and program is very interesting, but why is it still a pilot phase so late in the EU day? I would have expected this to have been done a long time ago. I do appreciate technological constraints, but nevertheless, are other member states more developed along this route? I don't know if you can speak to that, Philip. And then I have another question for Giada and Niall. What is behind the low numbers in European studies? You'd have imagined that Brexit would have stimulated interest, and particularly with Ireland now, except for Malta being the only native English-speaking member state. And then there is another question for those who want to take it. Does the non-availability of standalone European studies programs are not available in Northern Irish units? Does this limit the scope for research formal projects on European matters? Okay, and then there's one more for Andrew as well. Andrew, has the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and particularly atrocities and attacks on civilian infrastructure, shifted the Irish view of neutrality at all in an EU context? Now, there's one question later, but I think 4 is enough for the first round, and then we'll go and have the second round. So who wants to start with the answers? Phil, do you want to start?
I mentioned to Paul directly, what I didn't say, the elephant in the room, is the Department of Education's Blue Star program. So there has been a program running at primary level for quite a while. I guess the main distinction between that program and ourselves is that that program focuses quite a lot on member state similarities and differences, rather than the EU as the association and the entity. And also where it does focus on the EU, it pretty much takes a lot of its content directly from the EU institutions, which is quite good stuff. And we've had teachers come back recommending it, but it wouldn't be as critical or analytic as we're hoping to develop in content. That we're not trying to sell the European Union, we're trying to discuss it as a relevant entity, I guess. And while I'm speaking, I'm just going to put one tiny thing into what I think Andrew will speak to about the Ukraine. It's something I should have said as well. At secondary level, all teachers and the curriculum is highly geared once you go beyond the national level to the international level, but it's the global level. It's not the European level quite often. So students are very interested in defense, international politics, sustainable development, war, conflict at international level, but they kind of miss this whole relevance of the EU as a major international actor, as do their teachers in our discussions with them. And teachers are very quick to say that to us.
Great, thank you. I don't know, Niall, Giada. Giada's not there anymore, but Niall,
Yeah.
perhaps.
I'm happy to take Paul's question on Giada and my behalf. So the decline in standalone European studies programs in Northern Ireland predates Brexit, and perhaps that was a canary in the coal mine in the way that Ken was talking earlier, Europeanization levels, but that's the case, and the numbers that we were using were based on an article from 2014 and then updated slightly by Giada and for Ireland. And so it would be nice, I think, to delve a bit more deeply into some of the numbers and to look particularly to gather some data for Northern Ireland into the levels of study of the European Union outweigh specific European studies programs, and see what the take-up is for modules on the European Union, and other sort of areas of research in that sense, and areas of teaching that students get. So that would be, I think, the added benefit of doing some of this research would be we could update and update our understanding of where European studies is at post Brexit. So then maybe that's something that needs to be done, that Giada and I are maybe working on. So I would say that's how those two things, the Brexit context and European studies, have related to each other up to now, and we would like to increase our understanding on that.
Perfect, thank you. I don't know, Andrew, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just to kind of throw in a couple of things, I'll talk to the Ukraine question directly, but just to say one thing before I forget it, and I'm sure others on this call will be familiar with this as well, but the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs is really quite concerned about declining numbers of Irish people working in the EU institutions. And over the last kind of 5 years, or maybe even a bit more, they've been proactively trying to encourage, good graduates to apply for posts within the EU. So I think, in terms of kind of knowledge of the EU, but also the language bit, in Department of Foreign Affairs is, an important actor, obviously, to be aware of, and a route into government. And it might be interesting to know how far, this is a case of Foreign Affairs talking or not talking to, Department for higher education now, in terms of joined up government and so on. So that's just one thing, just to note, I think, which is interesting. And then specifically on the Ukraine question, my reading of this is that there has been a shift, but it's a quite subtle one, let's just say, compared to Sweden and Finland's decisions to join to join NATO. But what's been striking to me is that the rhetoric from, you know, Micheál Martin and Simon Coveney down, and from many other, you know, TDs and politicians, has been along the lines of, in the context of the Ukraine war, Ireland is militarily neutral, but it's not politically neutral. And for me, that's a kind of quite kind of significant shift. And then maybe two other bits. I mean, obviously, Ireland is, you know, has contributed non-lethal assistance to Ukraine through the EU's European Peace Facility, and Ireland is also going to contribute some personnel to this EU training mission for the Ukrainian military, which is being established, being set up now, I think, in Poland. So I think there's a shift around the language around neutrality, and I think there is a kind of greater willingness to engage proactively, if you like, with EU CSDP. And again, also, if you look at the various opinion polls, and there are, you know, tracking opinion polls that always ask the same question, so it's a bit difficult to read them. But if you look at the opinion polls, I think they do seem to indicate a shift towards probably a somewhat greater willingness to kind of engage with the EU around security and defence, as opposed to the view that EU security and defence cooperation might be seen as something threatening neutrality. And just while I have the floor, then one other point I think would be very much to agree with Philip's point about students being interested in global issues, and, you know, things like environment, you know, migration, trade, technology, AI, cyber, and it just strikes me that you know, in all of those areas the EU is engaged, and in some of those areas, you know, some of the sort of best academic analysts would argue that the EU really is an important global player, and arguably even the leader. So I think, you know, that point about sort of linking up the EU kind of as an international actor with this new agenda of global issues is maybe, you know, interesting and useful to think about. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything to any of those, or do you want to take a new question?
I actually, if I could use the opportunity now, just ask Philip a question about the second level curriculum, because it just strikes me that history would be, you know, the obvious point where you might see that story of EU membership, and yeah, you know, the Irish economic development as well in the 70s and 80s would be part of that curriculum. And I'm just wondering, is that a space in the exam cycle curriculum that you're identifying as somewhere we could slot in, you know, some useful teaching?
On history, I can't speak because Emmanuelle has taken that subject to analyze. But across the board, I mean, we had business teachers come to us and geography teachers come to us saying, look at this exam question from 2-3 years ago, and look how applicable the EU is to it. And they were the ones coming to us to say that before we analysed the curricula systematically. So Emmanuelle has taken history, and I know she has plans for junior cert to look at it. But because the teachers don't necessarily want full classes, they just want bits of content that they can plug and play, it opens up the opportunity to us for that. I mean, the English one last year was a major revelation to us. And when the teacher showed us that question, we were like, God, yeah, most students will respond to this. It was about developing a political speech. Most students will respond with an Irish speech, an Irish actor, but if they had that extra bit onto it to widen the context, and the curricula and how they're assessed at second level allows a lot of leeway for teachers to go down rabbit holes and for that to be assessed, and allow students to go down rabbit holes. There is quite a lot of opportunity. And even in the curricula, there's a lot of opportunity around strands of policy, environmental, conflict, sustainable development at both levels, junior and senior cycle. And yet the content so far has only focused on, in terms of textbooks, has only focused on the institutional stuff. So there are those opportunities there that we can see.
That's great. Unless there's somebody who wants to come back on any of those points, because otherwise we still have one question. That's a question about all of us to I guess think about the curriculum. Paul was asking here in his day, the College of Europe had 6-week introductory module on European history and institutions, and then students choose between law, economics, and political science faculties for their main studies. Is there any scope for taking this approach to the Irish graduate or postgraduate sector? What do you reckon? What could we think about that?
I might jump in there, Christian, unless Andrew wants to offer to teach that politics, international relations 101 for the entire sector. It would be very useful. But yeah, no, I think there is scope for that. I mean, I think it's a discussion that's been knocking around for a couple of decades, I think, in the third level sector about whether you call it a broad curriculum or an open curriculum, particularly in the first year, and it's always picking up in the North American model of how you design third level studies, that you don't specialize too early. You take a more general start in your program. I know in DCU we'd have some scope to do it in our joint honours program, and to a lesser degree in economics, politics and law as well. So I mean, there is an opportunity for us to think. We saw in the 2 years of COVID that we can be quite flexible and dynamic in short periods, and I think there are opportunities for us to think about how we deliver some of our courses and some of our modules in a way that could give that ground level knowledge first and then allow students to specialize later on. So I think it's definitely worth exploring.
Thank you. Anybody else who wants to offer some? Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, to what extent should we perhaps think of decoupling the study of the European Union from languages? Because I don't know about Northern Ireland, but I know in the rest of the UK that is what is mainly driving down this decrease in student numbers on European studies. It's the fact that languages can be dropped for A level. So I mean, I can't remember the exact details of what you need to do now, but I think it was in a way in an attempt at making school more interesting and prevent, trying to get people to stay in school for longer. There was this idea that, doing modern languages was no longer compulsory. And a few years later, the effect was that we keep seeing the number of students sitting A levels in German, in French, in Spanish, it's going down. German in a lot of schools now is no longer taught. And that has an effect eventually in universities, that there are less and less students doing European studies. So I'm just wondering whether there would be scope to actually try and have the study of the European Union, of the policies, the politics, perhaps as a subject not necessarily linked to languages. I agree that different cultures and languages are at the heart of the EU, but it seems to be a little bit of a victim of this decreasing interest or lack of interest in languages. So perhaps we should actually separate these subjects or give an opportunity to students to study the EU with other languages. I don't know.
Anybody who dares to reply? Yeah, Ken.
I'll jump in because I did mention languages and we're discussing. So in the Irish context, you still modern language, and I'm open to correction list, but it's still a requirement for matriculation to third level. So if you want to enter a university, you have to have studied one until the leaving cert. Personally, I think that's a positive thing, and I think that's it's an essential skill. But I think there's a point, and in a sense, in DCU, you can study the European Union without studying languages. So you can do it in our IR program, you can do it in economics, politics, law. EU law is a core part of our law programs as well. But I think in the back of our heads, there's the point that Andrew raised, where our Department of Foreign Affairs and our position in the European Union has been, we're highlighting the need to maintain the Irish presence in European institutions. And by reducing the importance of languages, we would be creating another barrier to our students going on there. We've had some success with Irish language, all right, but I do think it's important to communicate to students as early as possible that if they see that pathway as something they want to pursue, a modern language has to be part of that. But I think you're right in terms of the broader knowledge of the EU. We shouldn't, and that's that European studies trap I was talking about. We shouldn't kind of side ourselves or cut ourselves off from people on those grounds. It's important to get as many people as possible develop their knowledge of the European Union, because it's an important part of how our lives are governed and our societies are governed.
And perhaps also, in a sense, using the opportunities that we have, let's say, from bringing in those other disciplines, like Paul was saying, like bringing in like law and politics into one degree, and bringing in maybe economics as well, and keeping that nicely focused on the European Union or something like that. And after all, the students, like you said, perhaps some of them already know the language, and then they can do it optionally. They don't necessarily have to do it mandatorily. And maybe some of them don't really want to do languages, but then they'll still get the knowledge, and then they see maybe, some people find out much later that they have a talent into something, and then they do it when they find out. And we can leave that option open to them. Andrew wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just to say, I guess the kind of the distinction between European studies programs, where you have programs which are specifically European studies, and a central component of that is the EU, versus politics IR programs within which the EU is a significant part. And in general, my view would be that students are kind of self-selecting more for the politics and IR programs rather than the EU programs. And I don't know whether that's because they find the language challenging, or they don't want the language, or whether it's more just because they feel they're more interested in the range of global issues. And I mean, going back to my first point about being social scientific about it, and what do we actually know, that would actually be something that would be quite significant to actually know, in terms of what is language something that students are afraid of, or it puts them off from a program, or would they just choose kind of a more global program for other reasons anyway? And I mean, I suppose most education systems, but certainly to quite significant degree, the Irish education system is kind of market driven, in the sense of from school level to undergraduate degree, points drives things, and then again with masters programs, most students are self-funding, and it's a market in that sense. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other? Anybody wants to make any final suggestions? Any perhaps remarks about anything that's been said, or anything that we haven't discussed? I see relative contentment in everybody's faces from what I can see. So perhaps then, yeah, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just wondering, that's a question for Ken. Having the experience of teaching in Slovakia, so a relatively new EU member state, so did that have any bearing on your experience, on the kind of level of knowledge or interest?
It was interesting in the sense that the students I was teaching were self-selecting. They were studying at an Institute for European Studies and International Affairs, and doing a master's in either international relations or European studies. So they were very active, very interested, saw career progressions and potential career paths in that direction. But I suppose we've gone over and back to Slovakia for a long time for family reasons, and the Slovak on the street doesn't necessarily share that enthusiasm for European issues. And I think you'd find very similar conversations about, you know, broader public attitudes towards the European Union, as you do in an Irish context, about our perhaps a high level of cynicism towards European institutions and to politics more generally. Not a very strong level of engagement. Slovakia is slightly unusual in that was one of the first, I think, was the first of the post-2004 countries to adopt the euro, but that was very much, I suppose, an elite-driven set of decisions. So I think in Slovakia there's a gap between those people you meet at Institutes for European Studies and those self-selecting students, and what the broader public attitude is, and it is a similar challenge in terms of how European education occurs at primary level and at secondary level, as you know, both Phillips and your project is looking at.
No, that's great. Do you want to respond? Yep.
Can I just add? I was only thinking before Ken mentioned. I mean, I'm not I've never researched on the European Union. My area is more young people's attitudes. But just from in the last 6 months going to schools, the first thing we ask them is to draw what comes to their mind when they think of the European Union. And I mentioned the economic element and how that dominates. But it strikes me that it's a great time for us to be going in there because of Brexit and because of the invasion of Ukraine. And aside from those political realities and all the knock-on effects of that, it has meant that teachers and students have almost had a jolt back as to the significance of the European Union from where we're coming from, but also Europe and the relevance of Europe and all of that. So it is a great opportunity, or it's a great time, I think, as somebody where it's not my primary research area. I was very lucky that I landed here when I did and this time, because there's a really big appreciation for it there. And they're all drawing Brexit, and they're all drawing, and Andrew mentioned NATO. A few students last week kept drawing NATO, and then we had 5 minutes on how NATO is different to the European Union on foreign policy. So from my side, there's a great opportunity there. It's a good time to be in the space and in the area, I guess.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, unless there's any final comments, I think then I would like to start by thanking the European Commission for providing us all with the opportunity of this co-funding, the Jean Monnet Teacher Training Grant. I think we've had an excellent day. It was a great pleasure to have all the speakers here today. You've done us really proud. You've done really excellent presentations. We had great discussions. I really enjoyed it, and I think I learned very much. I think we can take notes of what we've learned during the first day, because tomorrow we'll be back. Tomorrow we'll have the second day, and we'll start at 10 o'clock. So a little bit later, we'll start at 10 o'clock with the first panel, teaching the European Union perspectives from various disciplines. And we have 4 presenters there, Professor Joachim Fischer, then Dr. Christy Petit, Dr. Niall Moran, and Dr. Conor Galvin, who is also from UCD, the third of the teacher training grant holders from Ireland. And after that, relatively directly after that, we have our keynote lecture by Professor John O'Brien from Maynooth University. So I'm looking forward to seeing as many of you as possible also tomorrow. And I thank every one of you. I thank Philip, I thank Andrew, Ken, Giada, Niall, and of course, all of you that have listened to us and have asked important questions. Paul, thank you also for all of your questions. And I thank you all for your interest, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. So thank you very much, and see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.